Welcome. This is the South African Chamber of Commerce. I'm Sharon Constanson, Chairman of the Chamber, and I welcome all of you who have joined us today. I'd like to introduce Arlene from the BEE Chamber, who will talk first from a BEE perspective. I'll be back with you in a moment. Arlene, if you could join us on the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Arlene Wilson-Max, and I am an executive at the BEE Chamber. Now, we focus predominantly on broad-based Black economic empowerment, and our partnership with the SA Chamber is to predominantly promote what this thing is called broad-based Black economic empowerment. We have about 14,000 members who are all BEE practitioners and who participate in the implementation of BEE on a daily basis. We also are a membership-driven organization, just like the SA Chamber, and we offer benefits as well as support services to the members of our chamber. I have a short video that I'd like to quickly play for you that will explain a little bit about why broad-based Black economic empowerment was created and why it's so important.
BEE Chamber. In 2010, the National Development Plan set a goal to increase the employment rate from 13.6 million to 24 million people by 2030. The number of individuals employed needs to increase by 9 million between now and 2030. Then BEE was introduced in 2007 to secure contributions from government and business towards economic growth, enabling inclusion of more South African citizens to address unemployment and alleviate poverty. If the National Development Plan and BEE was designed to grow the GDP and create jobs, then why has unemployment increased after their introduction? Our population has grown from 41 million in 1994 to 60 million people today. In that time, the number of employed South Africans has also grown by 6 million, from 8.9 million to 15 million, representing a growth in employment rate from 20% to 28.5%. However, the unemployment rate has increased over the same period from 22% to 32.6% because population growth has outperformed job creation by a factor of 3 times. What this means is that South Africa's population growth has outperformed the country's job creation. The distribution of unemployment remains highly racially skewed, with white unemployment sitting at only 8.8%, which is on par with France and is lower than Italy and Brazil. Whereas the South African Indian unemployment rate is 11.8, colored 25.7, and African 36.5, making African unemployment the 7th highest in the world. The exceptionally high unemployment rates for Indian, colored, and especially African men and women is the reason for Black economic empowerment in South Africa and the reason for the objective of the BEE Act being meaningful participation in the mainstream economy for Black people. Join the BEE Chamber today to understand more about the original intent behind BEE and how you can align your business targets and plans to contribute as a good corporate citizen and to achieve a level of pride from your corporate contributions. As a member, you will access up-to-date information, support, guidance, services, software and training to support your transformation journey.
Thank you, everyone. Sharon, I'd like to hand back over to you for you to introduce our presenter this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arlene. Every time I look at those stats, I think, goodness me, I can't believe the rate at which the population has grown. Our first speaker is going to be Riona Stradum, who is a consultant to the BEE Chamber. And she's got a BCom degree and she's worked in tourism, she's worked in marketing, and she's been involved with the publishing of the Code of Good Practice and very involved in the peripheral legislation side of things. So it's something where she is very passionate about the BEE outcomes and therefore talks to that in a very competent manner. She will then, after her presentation, will be followed by Dion. Dion and I are going to be doing more an in-conversation style. I'm now going to hand over to Riona and let's hear from her perspective on the issues of skills development and bursaries. Riona, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. As Sharon mentioned, my name is Riona Strydom. I am one of the technical specialists at the Chamber, and today I am going to take you through, well, basically the skills development scorecard, which is an element within the BBEE legislation. So if you give me a quick second to share my screen, just give me a thumbs up, Sharon, if you can see my screen. Right. All right. So I'm going to keep this brief because there's a lot of devil in the detail. As we know, BBEE is an ever-changing environment. It's not as black and white, mind the pun, as you would think. So I'm going to keep it brief as to not bore, and sometimes it can be an information overload. So what you have on the screen at the moment is called a BBEE scorecard. The scorecard is broken down into various elements. What you're looking at the moment is the scorecard for the general codes. Bear in mind that there are certain sectors where codes have also been gazetted, BBEE codes, and which look a little different, but again, we don't have enough time to go through all of it. So I am going to share the general codes, which is basically the baseline for all the other sectors. What we are going to tackle in this session is skills development. What is important to note with skills development and BBEE, it is considered a priority element. Now, for the companies that deal with BBEE, priority element means it's critical. There's penalties if certain measures are not met. And in this case, your level, the outcome of this scorecard in terms of points translates to a level. If you miss your priority element, or at least one of them, that level is discounted automatically, one down, which for companies is not a good thing, because you can imagine if you need to be a level 4, being discounted to a 5 could lead to business operations being impacted, contracts being not awarded or taken away because of that. Now, if we look at the skills development scorecard, it measures certain things. There's certain categories of the scorecard that is, well, what you spend on training as a company is measured in terms of a points scoring exercise. Now, there's targets and then there's points. For skills development, what we're looking at from a target aspect is a percentage, and you can see the breakdown of the different categories of the scorecard. But that percentage that is your target is based off of your salary bill. We call it levyable amount, but it is your total salary bill. So what remuneration is paid to employees. Now you've got a target. You can see 3.5%, 2.5%, and 0.3% of spend on Black people. Now, for my audience, just as a means of context, what is the definition of Black in terms of the codes, in terms of BBEE? It refers to a person that is either African, colored, or Indian, a South African citizen, either by birth or by descent, or who have become a South African citizen through naturalization. When we look at naturalization, we are speaking about a South African citizen prior to 27 April 1994. That has a significance for those who know the history of South Africa. I don't want to go into too much details. There's not enough time. But the skills development scorecard measures what you have spent, or what companies have spent on training of Black people, and that translates into points, as you can see. The first categories of the scorecard, which is these three categories, measures the spend. The second category, well, the next category measures the people, and in this case, on a learnership program. Now, a little bit later on in my slides, I will speak to the types and categories of training that we get that further translates into points on the scorecard. But it is important to note that there are certain measures that we have to follow when measuring skills development. To make it a bit more tricky is that your skills expenditure follows what they call the EAP, economically active population. And to break that down for you in maybe more simple terms is South Africa is, well, Stats SA, South Africa has broken down the people that work in South Africa into the different race and gender groups. So you've got a target or a stat per race and gender. So you can see African, colored, Indian, white, foreign, male, and female. Now for BEE purposes, we're looking at Black. So what is measured in the scorecard, if I can quickly go back to the scorecard, is we consider the economically active population in the scorecard, which basically means, and again in simple terms, is you have a target spend. So you can see if I take the first target of the scorecard, which is 3.5%, that 3.5% is further broken down into the EAP, which means you actually have a target per Black race and gender group, or per the EAP. We take the white and foreign component out. We do a calculation to get adjusted EAP, and that adjusted EAP, you can see what it translates into from a target percentage. That percentage for African males, which is the big blue part of the circle, then you have your African females, and then your smaller portions of the EAP. But it basically takes that 3.5% of the scorecard, which is the first category of the skills scorecard, and it breaks it down into a spend per race and gender group that is represented by the EAP. Very important to note that if you, so not only does the target consider the EAP, but also the points. So you can't just go out into the market and train, for argument's sake, African males. From a score perspective, you would not secure the full 6 points for that particular category. Right. What do we measure? So skills development is, as I said, training of Black people, but there's certain costs that is considered as training from a BEE perspective. It's called legitimate training expenses. The obvious first one is the cost of the actual training, the cost of the trainers, if there's materials, books, laptops, whatever the case may be, that forms part of a person successfully being trained. That is all recognized towards the scorecard. Just a note that makes it a little bit more tricky in the scorecard is that related cost items such as travel, accommodation, food, venue hire, things like that, which is considered as related costs. So it's not directly a person being trained, but it facilitates their training. It's called related training expenditure. That has a limitation of only 15% recognition in the scorecard. So basically what it means is the skills scorecard is nudging companies to do more training, focus on upskill training, formal training, rather than spending your money on, for instance, related costs, venue, etc. All right. Training in the codes have different categories. It's been called the learning program matrix. So you have a category A to G. Each training intervention in South Africa can be either grouped or classified as A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. What is important from a skills perspective is that you measure the outcome, the learning achievement. As you can see with category A, as an example, which is bursaries, the measurement here is the end result is a qualification, a degree, a diploma, or a certificate, full-time theory. I'm not going to go through all of it. You can see on the screen, as I said, for the scorecard to secure points, this is the different categories in which training has been grouped. Each, as I said, has got a different outcome. Maybe just some insights into when we go for verification or when a company is audited from a BEE perspective. As much as you have trained people, as much as you have the data, you have to prove this when it comes to a BEE audit. So at after your financial year, 12-month period, there's an audit phase that happens. A B audit takes place, and there's certain documents and evidence that you need to put forth in that audit in order to secure your points, the 20 points that is available on the scorecard. You can see there are certain requirements. I'm really not going to go into that detail, but just bear in mind that companies have to provide sufficient evidence to back up their claim from a skills perspective in order to score the points. Now, yes, some companies do treat skills BEE as a transaction, so spending money equaling points, where from a chamber perspective, from the BEE chamber perspective, we are in the business of transformation. So we take this approach, and it's kind of built into our culture that with every element, yes, though it has a score and a level at the back of it, there's a money transaction from a BEE perspective, but you have to consider almost want to say the long-term effect. What are you really building towards? And this is where we look at the benefits of skills development. Now, most companies, when they do training, it is to upskill their staff, considering, potential future workforce. Succession planning is part of that. But not only that, once a company invests in their employees, once they train them on sufficient, what's the word I'm looking for? Valuable long-term training solutions, not just a short course just for the sake of spending money on individuals. You are building I'm going to use the word better employee, but that translates into, retaining of staff members, because they feel you are investing in them. It's not just, a point scoring exercise, just spending money for the sake of spending money. You're creating a skilled workforce, then maybe looking at it from a transformation aspect. When we look at a sustainable BEE model, there's two workflows. We call it a human capital work stream and a supply chain work stream. You can't access the economy of South Africa without education. So now you can either create a human capital work stream through education, or through education, you can swing it around and create a supply chain, educated supply chain, creating more business, creating wealth within the economy of South Africa. So there are benefits of skills. It is not just to train people for the sake of training. There is a bigger picture in terms of skills, in terms of BEE. That's basically my part of it. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail. It can be a lengthy discussion. I hope I've given enough context into the element, but like I said, there's a lot more devil in the detail.
Thank you, Riona. I knew it was a minefield. Now you've just confirmed for me it's an absolute minefield. And the part that actually I found quite a little bit distressing, but I don't deal with it, so I don't know all the kind of data you have to use to support that. It's not my day job, so it feels like quite a big thing that one has to do. I'm sure for HR professionals and organizations that have those infrastructures and departments, this is all the day job. I'm going to now call on Dion to join us. Dion has had her business now for 24 years, Siaka Consulting, and her focus has been on transformation, development, and strategy. And we're going to hear from her how she has worked in this business area for both public and private sector. She's spoken in numerous conferences. She's a thought leader in the space. She's very passionate about community development and also that of the development of entrepreneurs, which is supporting self-help, being able to survive as people then can earn money and develop themselves. And in the many years she's been in a non-banking world, she left 24 years ago, she's been involved in the National Association of BEE Consultants, Association of B-BBEE Professionals, and the Wisdom Board, and Shared Value Africa Initiative, Sustainability Africa Forum. I'm going to stop there. You can read her bio. She is seriously impressive. Dion, thanks so much for joining us. It really is a pleasure to have all of you to spend the time with us. But what I'd like to just maybe ask a couple of questions. And the first one I want to ask is sort of a very broad question. If you look at your business and what you have done and focused on in the last 24 years, how has that focus changed? What was the key thing 24 years ago, halfway through now? And then maybe looking in more detail in the current, what are the key themes that are really critical in this environment that you're working on? Where are you spending most of your consulting? Where are companies needing the most degree of help? So if you cover that in the broadest, then we'll look at something a little bit more into the detail of some of the issues. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Sharon, and thank you everybody for your time today. I think a little bit of our journey would answer that question. So we landed up advising in BEE almost by accident 24 years ago. I had left the stockbroking industry, and I was asked by a peer in the stockbroking industry to say, we've heard about this thing called a transformation charter. It was 1998. And the BEE Act was only promulgated in 2003. So there was nobody consulting in BEE per se at the time. And they were very worried. It was Merrill Lynch that we were working with, that South African government would restrict foreign investment and or seize investment assets which were held in South Africa at the time. So we started looking at BEE. It was before there was a scorecard, before there was legislation, and really advising the international investment banks. As the journey has moved along, so we really have focused on becoming an implementer of BEE, and we've had the fortune to be able to work all over the world in talking about what we obviously don't call BEE elsewhere in the world, but Australia introduced the Australian Indigenous Economic Development Policy in 2010, which is essentially BEE. We've worked with companies in Canada, specifically looking at their minority groups and inclusion around their minority groups and legislation. In New Zealand, I serve as a trade advisor to the New Zealand government. We look at the Waitangi Treaty and specifically operating within that market. UK, we were involved during the London Olympics around the tender criteria in order to make sure that diversity and inclusion were included at that process. So I think the concept of Black economic empowerment has shifted considerably in the last 24 years. Certainly for businesses operating in South Africa, I think what the tenure of time gives us is that we move the executive thinking away from scorecard and more towards ethos. So while the rest of the world is talking about ESG, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter and racial audits, and we're talking about DEI and these negative perceptions of corporate global businesses now needing to shift or be penalized for their lack of diversity, in South Africa, I think our thinking has moved away slightly to say we understand the value in being diverse organizations. It's wrong to discriminate. We need to be inclusive, and it makes perfect business sense that the demographic of your business should match the demographic of the market you're operating in. So if I buy locally in South Africa from a supplier on my doorstep who happens to be Black, because the majority of our South African population is as well, then there's a cost reduction. There's a carbon footprint reduction in importing goods and services. There's a mitigation of currency fluctuations. There's a risk mitigation in needing to hold more stock than I need. So I do think that the tenure of time, not for all South Africans, obviously, because we do have a legacy issue to address at the same time, but I do think the tenure of time means that people have now gone from resisting it to really taking the time to understand it, to now starting to innovate within it. And finally, this aha moment, particularly in the global companies that used to operate here, in saying, we actually understand where the underlying value comes from. And interestingly, just this morning, I was on a call with a global investor, very heavily coming into South Africa on the back of COP26 commitments and renewables and that kind of market, and just saying that the work that South Africa is doing in social impact particularly is groundbreaking, actually, for the rest of the world, where we're arguing that everybody's got the E and the G in ESG, but nobody's perfected the social. I do think that that we are in a position inadvertently where we have a lot to teach in what we've learned on the social issues.
Thank you very much for that, Dion. One word that really jumped out at me when you were talking, and because it relates to my day job of doing corporate governance and working with boards, is this word inclusive. We cannot be any of the things that the BEE requirements are, or that our ESG or our stakeholder demands upon us are, until we get an inclusive mindset.
Right.
We have to first, and I had this challenge with somebody, is it D, E, and I, or is it I, E, and D? Because we've actually got it the wrong way around, because we've got to be inclusive first.
Right.
We then have got to treat people with equity, and so they've all got a fair opportunity, and the outcome will be diversity.
Right.
So it's an interesting debate. It was interesting that you talked about the inclusivity issue of it, which really is so critical. We live in a world today where technology has changed us. We were talking to some youngsters the other day and trying to explain that in the old days you had a telephone at home, and if you wanted to take a call, you had to be within 3 rings of the telephone, and you had to run and answer it, and people would accept that you had to get from the garden into to pick up the phone. But you only got to speak to people if you were both in the place where the 2 phones were starting and ending, not where we are today, where the youth can't even get their mind around that. How life has changed, and that is in probably 40 years that has changed. So that's just a very simple technology environment where our lives are so different. How is this impacting our youth, the unemployed, the to be employed, the to be educated? And how is technology supporting the individuals through that journey, as well as being an aid in some way?
So I mean, I think that's such a valuable question, and particularly on the context of your introduction, where you said one of the most important things we have to remember is that we need to be measuring. And I think that this is something, and Riona alluded to it in her presentation, that BEE has inadvertently achieved. I remember when we first started saying to people, please, I need a copy of your shareholders registers and minutes of meetings. And just at the most fundamental governance level, everybody said, well, I think the company secretary's got it, but maybe the CFO's got it. The amount of data that is gathered from a BEE perspective really is possibly underutilized by all of us in the industry and government more specifically. But I do think that it brings us to this greater technology question around what impact it will have both on transformation and diversity. It's interesting because automation is estimated to put 85 million people out of work by 2025. And that's kind of in the UK and European markets alone. That's before we start to look at Africa, where we still employ what they call labor-intensive mechanisms to roll out projects as a means to sustain job creation. But the real issue, if I take a look at technology, and I want to give you an example, is when we do mine community development, a lot of work in that area. And one of the things we do is social audits, and we do house-to-house census kind of auditing, I guess, in particularly around mine communities. And the information that we extract out of Mpumalanga, which is our coal mining industry, or a locality rather, is that you've got about an 87% smartphone utilization in those communities. Now, they're poor, they're impoverished. Your unemployment ratio is sitting at beyond 50%, but they still have a smartphone. And so South Africa's strategy to say, let's go and invest because of global pressure in more schools and more universities is somewhat misguided, because what we need to do is use technology and digital to enable skills learning and education for every person, because that's inclusive. The problem that you have is we, at the moment in South Africa, we pluck a child out of a rural area in the name of transformation and inclusion, and we take them into an inner city university, and we give them a bursary on the back of their tuition and their books, perhaps, but we don't give them living allowances. Culturally, in South Africa, the eldest son must still pay in to support his mother on a monthly basis. So, and he's got to fit in with his peer group. So he's got to look the part, dress the parts, and socialize in the right way. 38% of our classes are done using laptops and cell phones. So he can't afford those technologies and the data. So he holds down 2 jobs and studies. And we have a resultant 49% dropout rate in bursary kids that are relocated in order to exercise that opportunity. So we discriminate inadvertently when the strategy is about setting targets instead of about being meaningfully inclusive. And on the reverse side, mining in South Africa is set to automate by 2030, but we've got this collective massive billions of rands investment happening in that sector in enterprise and supplier development and developmental initiatives. But when we automate and flick the switch on those mines, we're still going to use imported technology. And then we're going to import electronic engineers because we don't have enough in South Africa to run those mines. So in actual fact, we are disenfranchising our own people through our mechanisms of technology without realizing that one of the biggest things in change and true inclusivity is that you can't do business the way you've always done it and then write an inclusion report. It's a misnomer. If you're truly inclusive, it's an ethos. It has to be the way in which we operate, and it requires a shift in your strategy.
I couldn't agree with you more. Really interesting. Thank you very much for that. And it is interesting how technology has changed the way we interface. I mean, even young kids today, you give them an iPad and they immediately swipe it. Right. Even I understand people's cats and you don't know how to do that. Anyway, we digress. We were talking about, you were talking about bursaries a moment ago and the investment in bursaries and some of the unintended outcomes that come as a result of that bursary scheme. If we just look at learning and development investment, sort of in a greater context, how does that support the organization's business strategy? We're talking about you having to rethink the ethos of the organization. And should we be singly looking on employees, or are there other aspects of learning and development that there should be investments in? I'm talking sort of the broader, how do we change that ethos and mindset?
I think that, so in about 2010, South Africa introduced a policy called the Industrial Policy Action Plan. And in fact, this was something dating back to 2004 that Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who was our deputy president under Thabo Mbeki, she introduced a framework called ASGISA, the Accelerated Shared Growth Initiative. All of this said, if the silver thread in transforming and changing our ability to be able to be globally competitive, market-related, sustained employability, and making sure that we achieve economic growth. All of that is underpinned by the silver thread of learning and development. But it means that we have to be not doing, which is what South Africans did initially. When BEE came out, they would create a register of accredited training providers. They would identify a budget. They would go to a BEE consultant and say, this is what we need to spend, make sure it counts on our scorecard, and then people would spend. But there was no measurement of outcome. There was no measurement of that translating back into a value proposition back within the business. Even to this day, it's a struggle to get businesses to understand that if I competently train my suppliers and I create a quality standard and make sure that every supplier meets those quality standards and I include depth in my supply chain, then ultimately what I do is I drive down my price vulnerabilities, and my access to product is then becoming more secure, both within the local market and just in terms of certified or quality product. So many times we hear companies say to us, we're kind of held to ransom by the supplier because he's the only one who delivers the product. Now, in South Africa, we're incentivized through BEE to invest in developing our suppliers, to invest in developing our people so that we have alternative suppliers, people, resources. But what's missing in intent, and this comes down to executive will and executives starting to understand the value of learning and development, is that we still see very few companies delivering training in a way that achieves learning pathways. Every junior manager should be ready to take the next step to middle management should be ready to take the next step to senior management. And I think that one of the challenges in this beautiful world that we live in, which is highly complex and ever-changing and technology moving faster than any of us can keep up, is we need agile, we need agility, we need depth of skills, we need people that can manage their way out of crises and change. And those kind of skills are missing in our businesses. Very few businesses say, this is how technology, environmental issues will impact our business in 20 years from now. This is what we're going to do to start investing now to make sure that as these businesses change. So it's very interesting to me when I see companies announce billions of rands being spent on a digital strategy for the business to convert to become digitally sound and robust, but they're not spending the equivalent amount of money on their own people and their own supply chain. And operationally, your strategy is only as good as your ability to deliver it. You're not going to deliver it without the right skills, resources, both in supply chain and in your employee groups. But I think just one level further, if we take a look at the Australian market as an example, and UK, interestingly, I see ranks in the lower 4 in the OECD countries in terms of the 16 to 24-year-olds on literacy levels and investment in learning and development. But Australia invests about $3 billion a year in corporate social responsibility, but nobody tracks it. A lot of that being spent in education and development, but nobody's tracking it. So if that money was spent cleverly, we would be using it to make sure that we are driving an ESG agenda and using our learning and development as a silver thread to connect our impact on communities, our employee groups, and our robust and agility of our teams and people, and ultimately in our supply chains, so that we've got supply chains that are ready for us as we transition our businesses in 5, 10, or 20 years' time.
Very interesting, and it is when you look at the ESG agenda of the world, it is the sorts of things we're looking at. But the one that a lot of people, when they look at the ESG, you get social, you get people also putting supply chain in there as being one of the things S can stand for. But it really is critical that we do look after our people. You were talking about spend and investment and the way that might improve the metrics, for example, looking at the metrics of the spend and therefore what that does. There's that adage that we discussed when we were doing our prep on this one, where CFO says we spend all this money and what do we get for it? Well, first of all, start the measurement that you're talking about. But we spend it on people and then they leave because somebody else steals them because they've now got the skills. And that's a typical don't spend finance approach to business, where I'm looking at the spreadsheet, I'm not looking at the outcome of having better people, happier employees. I've got the right ethos in my business. People want to come and work for me, so I'd be stealing other people's people rather. And the CEO's attitude to that in response to a finance person, that's why often finance people don't make very good CEOs, is what happens if we don't invest and all these illiterate people stay with us, and then we're stuck with a far worse problem. So the importance of investment in training is critical. But what I liked in your previous example was taking that sort of, it's almost like taking an ecosystem. Who else is in that ecosystem other than the internal stakeholder?
Right. And I think that, if you purely bring it down to the metrics, I think if we asked the same question 15 years ago, there wasn't enough data for us to be able to measure the return on investment. In the UK, they say for every pound that is spent on skills development and learning, and interestingly, your stats show the difference between men and women. So there's a £5.15 return on investment in men's learning and development who are employees. And I think it's £8.35 on women who are developed. So higher on women for whatever reason, I'm not 100% sure. In the US, they talk about a 353% return. Accenture's reports show that their latest 2022 reports say a 353% return on investment. I mean, there's very few other areas that you could invest to see such phenomenal returns. But I also think that the issue around skills development is that organizations can't afford not to train your employees. I just look at the amount of change that happens in every business in every day. And perpetually changes and how that needs to impact the way in which employees think. We've got a client, to give you an example, who they do a lot of work. They employ 30,000 odd people. They do a lot of work in outsourced services across multiple industries. And so they kept on being competed with by tiny little businesses that offer tiny little solutions, who were predominantly Black and located close to wherever the operations were. And that was their competition, which makes it very difficult for them to motivate cost increases and various other bits and pieces. And one of the things that we did is we looked at their investment in learning and development, and we looked at ESG. And between those two things, their ability to be able to go and deliver solutions, but the wet waste that is produced from their kitchens, they recycle into biodiesel, and they use that to develop small agricultural farmers. The energy solutions that they're putting into clients now produce reduced electricity, but they've had to reskill and retrain 30,000 people to teach them on how to be a caterer, a security guard, a cleaning lady, using ESG kind of principles in the way that they recycle, reuse, and repurpose. And that has been their value proposition to their customer base. So their absolute commercial growth, which sits at around 22% year on year, pulls back to their investment in training and development, which pulls back into make sure that your people have skills that are relevant to the market that you're servicing. And I think that's where we get it wrong. We see training as that thing at conferences where half of them don't pitch up and everybody feels fat afterwards because we ate more food than we needed. And we're not seeing it as this agile way of making sure that we are challenging people's thought processes, making sure that their skills are robust, changing the way in which they think about the futures of tomorrow, and really starting to innovate within the businesses that we do. And I think until we shift our thinking on learning and development, we'll continue to see it simply as a line cost item.
I think there are a lot of CEOs who would love to hear that and be able to produce that in soundbite to the FD.
And Sharon, which is really important, and for those South African businesses that are on the call, South Africa, and certainly the last time I looked at it was about 8 years ago, but South Africa at that stage was the third highest country in the world in terms of tax incentives, rebates, and grants for companies that spend on learning and development. So for every rand that you spend, you're claiming 65 to 85% back in the following year as incentives. You can actually claim more than 100%, but it's difficult, so I won't mention those numbers. But very, very much a concentration on saying do the right thing, and the incentives and rebates and the motivation to do it from a pure bottom line perspective should be there. And if you cannot justify why you're doing something, if you cannot show investment neutrality, so we invest in it and we're able to identify the commercial return, it's probably the wrong strategy. So, you need to keep looking, keep digging, keep re-innovating until you have the right strategy. And you'll know it's the right strategy when you can track the commercial return.
And what you're talking about, which is the whole aspect of ESG, DEI, BE, all these things is doing the right thing. And here we're talking about a specific element within the S through to the DEI aspect of these world best practices that we are now starting to embrace. The word that came to mind when you were talking about agility a little earlier was the word resilience. Mm-hmm. We learn how to not make those same mistakes, which gives us a degree of resilience as we are going forward as a business. And if I look at the learning and development, the investment, all the things you've spoken about, the word that comes to me as well is sustainable and resilient. So if businesses can be both those, you've got a much better chance of longer term survival, attracting the right talent, having the right customers because you're doing the right thing. We've got a couple of questions that have come from the floor. One of them was hearing a bit more about enterprise and supplier development and understanding that benchmark spend for skills development expenditure. Now, that might mean something to you guys more than it does me, and also how that compares between an SME and a corporate, particularly if you've got a degree of outsourcing occurring. Riona, if you'd like to come on camera for this last 10 minutes so that where there's feasibility for you to add content to the answers, you're there with us. Sorry, Dion, do you want to just respond?
Sure.
Because you started.
So I think the difference between ESD and skills development is that there's 5 indicators that we measure in BEE: ownership of the local enterprise, and specifically if you're a foreign-owned businesses or you're a UK business, for example, that chooses to domicile in South Africa to service your African clients, then for BEE measurement, we specifically ring fence the values, the employees, and the costs attributed to operating in South Africa alone. So it's not intended to prejudice businesses who choose to operate here, but operate across multiple markets. So we're measuring purely South African activity. So management control looks at your staff demographic and employee demographic, and we include age, race, gender, etc. Your skills development scorecard is about 25 points on the scorecard, dependent on which sector you operate in. ESD looks at who do we buy our goods and services from, and there's really 3 focuses of importance. The one is saying, let's buy from businesses that are in South Africa and operating in South Africa as a means to try and drive South African jobs and South African economic value, etc. The second criteria we measure is, are you buying from big or small? And around 30% of your procurement expenditure should be from businesses that are small. And small is constituted, and there are categories of small, but as anybody whose turnover is under 50 million rand a year. And then the last category is buying from businesses that are Black owned, and specifically have levels of Black women and Black ownership in South Africa. And that's your third category. Your ESD spend suggests that if you can't find small Black suppliers where they should exist in your supply chain, then let's open it up. And let's open it up on the back of capacitating those suppliers to operate. So in the early days of BEE, you see in your procurement triangle, your top suppliers were the ones that were highly specialized, usually multinationals, who earn 80% of your procurement spend, and 20% of your spend was the littlies. And what people did in the early days of BEE was they split up their contracts into tiny little bite-sized chunks because of the risk of doing business with small businesses. We did a report for the presidency in 2012, which looked at expenditure with SMMEs in South Africa. Government expenditure had moved from 6% in 2009 to 28% by 2012. That's a significant shift, and one of the highest in the world. Our expenditure with SMMEs is large and growing, and as a result, it drives a very robust market. But the problem behind all of that is a lot of those programs are not fundamentally on the foundation of learning and development. So best practice says that what you'll do is you'll put a quality standard in place for suppliers. You will make sure that they're all certified, accredited, and developed to that quality standard. So ultimately what we achieve is we shift 2 things. We shift the procurement guys thinking from saying, I'm buying from you because you're small and Black. Actually, he's buying from you because you're quality, you're accredited, and you're as competitive as the guy in the office next door to you. And that's important from the procurement shift. And from the SMME shift, don't ask people to buy from you because you're small and Black. You're not a beneficiary. If you're a beneficiary, then you're a charity. And the idea around SMME development is not charitable. It's fundamentally about saying, let's create a robust, competitive, and quality supply chain that we can procure from. So there is the connection, but with different targets. And your target on enterprise and supply development is up 3% of your net profit after tax in each year, if you put the 2 together. But that can be spent in monetary or non-monetary. So it could be training and development and support by your own team, or it could be providing those services to them externally.
Fantastic, Dion. As you say, Riona, you were talking about the devil is in the detail. My goodness, we're starting to get some of that Dion's been alluding to. Riona, is there something you would like to respond to on that question?
No, I think Dion covered it sufficiently.
There is another question, maybe, Riona, that you'd like to respond to first now, if you can, is what are the skill sets that South Africa is short of that investment could benefit those skills being created within our economy?
So That's a very broad answer because there's a lot of skills shortages. An example that I can bring across is in South Africa, we've got different SETAs. Now the SETAs exist because of the different industries. Now each SETA, as an example, if you looked at the MICT SETA, which is the Media Information Communication SETA, the ICT SETA basically, they have different chambers within the SETA, and each chamber identifies what they call critical skills that are lacking in that industry. The same with your manufacturing SETA, the same with the construction industry. So there's a lot of skills shortages, critical skills shortages in South Africa that through the SETAs and the companies that are in South Africa and operate within these different SETAs try to minimize, mitigate, or try to achieve through skills development. I want to tie it back to BEE, where there's a prerequisite now for skills, which means you cannot score points for skills development if you haven't addressed a priority training intervention as identified by the SETAs through skills development. If you haven't, you're scoring 0 for skills. So just by looking at, I think it's the Department of Higher Education has identified a list of 10, critical skills shortages or scarce skills within South Africa. And to name 1 or 2 of them, accounting is at the top of it. Accounting, your artisans, although you have a lot of companies that train through apprenticeships to bring back those skills, those artisan skills. There's definitely a shortage still in South Africa. Engineers, a lot of engineering companies go abroad to bring that skills into South Africa because there's just not enough in South Africa. So it is there's a list of, I think, hundreds, if not thousands of skills shortages in South Africa. And the way that we try to address that is through skills and through BEE and through the SETAs and what they've identified as priority skills or scarce skills within South Africa. Now, obviously, by identifying those interventions and not just tackling one as per the code's requirements, but rather focus on, investing in those skills, creating that skilled workforce, skilled South Africa. You might see, more businesses being created, being developed. You can swing it towards your enterprise and supply development. As an example, you can start with your own supply chain and identify from procurement where there is a potential gap, and through identifying that, develop, create a small company, train, educate, and therefore, closing that gap or the scarcity of skills within South Africa. A big, long answer, but yes, that is my response to that question. I hope it is sufficient.
That's very, very complete. I think for the last minute and a half or so that we've got, excluding, in fact, I'll say goodbye. So maybe for the last 30 seconds each. Dion, is there a finishing statement you would like to make? Something, words of wisdom you'd like to leave with the audience?
I don't know about words of wisdom, but I mean, I certainly think, for me, I and anybody who knows me knows I say this all the time, there has never been a more exciting time. I don't think. I know people complain that it's intimidating. I think it's a terribly exciting time to be an adult and operating in any of the economies of the world right now, and starting to see that there is no problem that is unique to any particular part of the world. We're feeling the same pain in different degrees of certainty or uncertainty, as the case may be. And I think what it simply draws us towards as individuals, as mothers, as fathers, as human beings, as members of society, and particularly in our business roles, is that there is an opportunity for us to play a difference in the trajectory of the worlds we live in. And I think it brings us to the point where we have to argue, are we authentic? Do we do things for the right reason? Are we really taking the time to understand it before we judge it? Is our dialogue, by its very Just the way in which we discuss issues is very resistant to change. And I think we need to shake ourselves up a little bit, collaborate a little bit more, look at things differently, and realize that a great strategy will be one that actually adds value. Transformation, inclusion, and all of the facets that come with it should add value if it's done correctly.
And in the words of good governance, doing it right first time doesn't cost more.
Absolutely.
It's when you mess it up and have to do it 3 times that actually costs more, and the outcome is still not there.
Spend more on cheating the system than they do on implementing. It's more expensive to cheat and have to cover your gaps. So,
yeah, absolutely, we see it in all aspects of governance. Yeah. Rihanna, a couple of seconds of words of wisdom.
How do I follow that? No, so for me it is, and I think I've opened with this when I shared my presentation, you cannot have a thriving economy without education. Education is where it starts. We have to, and I think you've seen it in the video about the shocking unemployed numbers. From a BEE aspect, we've got, various elements of the scorecard. We start with, if you look at the scorecard, it starts with ownership and goes down to socioeconomic development. But in my opinion, we actually have to flip it around. We need to start with a social aspect. We need to start with socioeconomic development. We need to start with the youth. We need to educate, train, because that leads to a thriving economy. So that's just my 2 cents worth in terms of what we're trying to achieve, looking at it from a transformation and a BEE aspect. It's far removed from a transactional exercise. It is about investment in transformation, and it starts with that social aspect, starts with the community, and at the forefront of it is definitely education and training.
Thank you so much, Rihanna. Thank you so much, Dion, Arlene. Your team have been amazing at being insightful. What is wonderful is these recordings exist, and the high number of people that come back to listen to them, and then pick up the previous recordings of the ones we've done before. There will be 6 in this series in total. We're now 3 down halfway, so please look out, guys. The next one will be coming in, I think, early February. We'll have to get through a cold winter before then on this side, while you guys go through your summer break. Thank you very much, Rihanna, Dion. You've been very insightful and very informative, and have approached it from such different perspectives. I really thank you very much. We unfortunately have to close now because we are over time, which I hate doing. Thanks to everybody who's been present. Thanks for staying the journey with us. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay well.
Thank you.